let the sheNEDigans begin. Long live the sheNEDigans. Hello and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Let's talk sheNEDigans. So, you guys have probably noticed, it's the most spooky time of the year. That's right, it is now officially October, and I cannot wait to start talking about some spooky stuff. It actually brings up to mind a conversation that I've always been wanting to talk about, but never really until now has it really become relevant to talk about. And that's basically me being a huge fan of horror. When is it a good time to introduce my child to horror? Obviously, being a huge fan of the horror genre since I was a late teenager, I have loved a lot of things that are more macabre, very spooky, and even lighthearted, and not necessarily like super dark or anything like that, but I have always loved things that are dark and unusual. And which brings me to this thing that I've actually really been thinking of for quite a while now, and that's the fact that, I'm a dad now. So, when is it okay for me to introduce Pippin, or if I have any more children, to, one of my favorite genres of all time? And honestly, it's not a very easy answer, and it's not because it's like, they are never allowed to watch horror because they're no, it's nothing like that. It's more so, it's not an easy answer because there are honestly multiple answers to this question, because there's a lot of factors you have to really put into effect here. One of them is, what kind of parent you are, how do you raise your children, the personality of your child as he's growing up. There's a lot of elements that you have to really put into whether or not certain elements are okay to introduce your child to horror. And obviously, one of the really big concerns that a lot of people come up with horror is the fact of they kind of lump it into, all horror is gory, all horror is super scary, and if you're super hyper aware of spiritual stuff when it comes to your faith, whether or not some of those things are okay for your child to watch, or even for you to watch, because you might be letting something in, which I don't really agree with that whole concept, but some people do. If you know me, I love horror, I defend it, I think it's perfectly fine and safe to watch as a Christian, as a Catholic. There's nothing wrong with it. Obviously, there are certain genres that are not okay to watch, but that's kind of a whole nother topic neither here. That's down the road. Right now, we're focusing on children in horror. Now, like I said, there's not really a right or wrong answer to this question, mainly because some parents who are perfectly fine with showing their children certain kinds of horror. So for this video, this is mainly coming from my perspective and how I would actually want to raise Pippin when it comes to my favorite genre. And actually something that's really funny, because these are actually conversations that my wife Saida and I have had even way before we had Pippin. How would we raise our children, when it comes to like entertainment, movies, video games, all that kind of stuff. And we eventually got to horror, of course. And oddly enough, I'm actually the more strict one when it comes to horror. Mainly because I have a full understanding of it, so it's like I know what shouldn't be watched, what can be watched, what kind of genres are okay to watch with Pippin, in front of Pippin, all that kind of stuff. I think the good place to start off is at the age when they are fully aware that they are watching a program of sorts, whether or not they're watching a movie, TV, or anything like that. When they're fully aware of that, age, 3, 4, so on and so forth a little bit later. And even if it's like, younger, like 2 or something like that, I would still say this kind of stuff would be okay. So obviously I wouldn't be showing anything necessarily horror, unless it's something like maybe like old black and white films. Although a lot of black and white films can have a lot of scary images in them, I would say, at least for the modern era, they are very tame, obviously. So watching things like the Universal Monsters, for example, I think that those are perfectly fine to kind of like bring in at any age. They can be scary, of course, like the Wolfman can be scary. I mean, when I was a kid, I was scared of the Wolfman. Frankenstein, Dracula, the creature from the Black Lagoon, they can all be very scary, but I would say when it comes to it, it's honestly a good time of age when to introduce your children to those kinds of monsters, because when it comes to, at least in my opinion, the Universal monsters, they are the easiest to explain, that they are simply just people in costumes, that they're telling a story, that they're acting, and whatnot. And then on top of that, the images, although I'm obviously very certain can be scary for children, there's a lot less frightening images and violent images, for example. Obviously there's no blood, there's no gore, there's no limbs being ripped off. So I would say that like stuff like Universal Monsters and other black and white films, I would say would probably be the easiest for younger children to watch, like with you as a family. Obviously not by themselves. You're not going to go ahead and put the Wolfman on for a 4-year-old. I would say, like, if it's around, like Halloween, that time of year, and you want to watch, like, a horror movie as a family, I would say those kinds of movies would actually be very safe. And of course, there's many children's films that you can also watch as family as well. There's stuff like The Nightmare Before Christmas, there's Halloween Town. They're not horror films, obviously, because they're not intended to scare you. They're more intended to like bring out the wonderment of October and things that are scary and Halloween. So obviously those are not scary movies. Those are simply holiday themed movies. So I would say, like, even those movies, I would say those would probably be even better to introduce to your children, and that way you can move on to things like the Universal Monsters and stuff like that. And as they get older, I'm thinking more like between 6 and 10. I would say like somewhere around there. I would say this is probably a good time to start introducing maybe some more, I wouldn't say intense horror, because definitely still no, but once again, as a family, and this is obviously, of course, of your judgment, what kind of scary movies you can watch as a family. For example, I would still say, keep things like the Universal Monsters in there, because that's very safe for you and your family to watch. And obviously keep the children's movies in there as well, like Night Before Christmas, Halloween Town. But this is around the time when you can start introducing some more mature movies. One example I would argue is probably It. And I'm not talking about the recent 2 It movies, mainly because, at least personally, I wouldn't introduce Pippin to those movies until he's way older. One, they're both rated R. I'm not going to show him that until he's at least a bit older. The oldest I would argue is maybe 13, maybe, but that's just because at least, okay, he's with family, he's watching it with me and Saida, or maybe others, and we can be like, okay, that yes, there's this frightening content, we can explain to him, all that kind of stuff. Obviously, he's much older now at this point. Obviously, he should know at this point, like, what's right and what's wrong on the screen. But anyway, kind of going back to younger age with movies like the original Tim Curry It. This movie, I would say, is a very safe movie when it comes to its content because it has a lot of scary elements, it has a scary monster, and on top of that there's also some other really good elements about it, about growing up, overcoming your fears, and there's a lot of really good stuff in the original It to really think upon and whatnot. Because remember, film is not just a source of entertainment, they do have stories to tell and they do have morals to tell as well. So I would say stuff like that's okay. Once again, it's not a hardcore horror movie, but for a kid it would be in many regards, at least I would think. There's also a lot of other horror movies similar to that style with It that I would consider them watching. There are some PG-13 horror movies that I'd be probably okay with showing, as long as like the frightening images and stuff are not incredibly intense. Now what you define as incredibly intense and what I define as incredibly intense are obviously two entirely different things, but you know, like I said, it's completely, it just depends on what you're comfortable with showing your child. And now we move on to like their teenage years. Now obviously this is when you can really start opening the door when it comes to horror movies. I would say it still really depends on what you want to show them, but for me personally, I would probably start introducing maybe some R-rated films, maybe. But it really kind of depends on the content in the film. Obviously, if there's nudity in it, I'm probably not going to be showing my 13-year-old that. I'm still going to wait much later to introduce that kind of stuff. When they're around this age, I would probably include maybe a bit more violence, maybe a little bit more blood, maybe some gore, it depends. When it comes to the concept of horror movies, or even just like violent content in general, or even like other content in these movies, it's obviously 100% up to you as a parent to use your own discretion when it comes to showing your children these kinds of movies. In a weird way, I am far more strict, yet in a weird way also comfortable when it comes to showing my children horror movies, because, you know, obviously I don't want to scare them. Well, I do, but not in, you know, a malicious way. I keep going back to horror, and yes, I keep getting scared when it comes to some of these movies. And obviously horror is very much like a roller coaster ride. It is a shot of adrenaline when you get scared, when you get a jump scare, when you get like really frightened and stuff like that. But in the end, these are actors. These are people pretending to be monsters, pretending to be evil spirits, pretending to be creatures of the night, and so on and so forth. At the end, that's really what they are. A man in a mask, like in Scooby-Doo. I know that maybe this video seems maybe a bit vague, but like I said, there's no real right or wrong answer when it comes to introducing your children to horror. Mainly because you might have a different method. I have my own method. You might be completely fine with showing your child an R-rated horror movie at like, I don't know, like 8 or 10. Personally, I wouldn't do that. If you have a reason for it, then good on you. You know, I can't judge you for that. I can't say anything about that, because maybe that's the way you were raised, and obviously you turned out completely fine. For me, obviously, I want to start off small and then work my way up. You know, I don't really want to get the hardcore things in there because, personally, like I said, I don't think children are necessarily ready for that. But once you start introducing them to the small stuff and then really start getting into it, like, you know, yes, these are scary, but they cannot hurt you. They are simply, like I said, they're simply people in costumes. They're just people doing stuff and whatever. And yeah, that might take the magic out of the movie, the spooky magic, but in the end, the horror genre is supposed to be a genre of fun. Yes, it can have a lot of really great, significant messages and yes, scares when it comes to it, but overall, it's supposed to be a genre of fun. Just like the month of October is supposed to be a month of fun when it comes to, you know, dressing up for Halloween, getting the cool spooky outfits on, getting the decorations up. It's spooky Christmas without the presents. Unless you count candy as presents, which, hey, those are cool too. So this is really the time to really start getting into that spooky mood. And when you are raising your children on that, it's really important to really assess what you're watching and the thing, or what you're playing if you're a gamer and stuff like that, because obviously you want your children to like the things that you like, but obviously you want to build them up to it. There were many elements when I was a child when I was introduced to horror at completely the wrong times. Like I said, this is me. Other children might like it, but for me, personally, I think it was wrong times when I watched it. A very funny story, I actually watched The Leprechaun when I was, I think it was like Leprechaun 3, at my aunt's house. One of my cousins were watching the movie, and it came to the scene when the leprechaun was tricking the casino owner into basically trying to make love with this girl. And as it turns out, the girl was actually this robot thing that came out of the TV. It was very, very weird. And I remember seeing that scene, and obviously that was one of the first times when I saw nudity. And that was also one of the first times that I saw, something, at least what I thought was very scary. Because, the leprechaun eventually came out. He, electrocuted this guy to death. He eventually killed these two guys by literally ripping their eye out with his cane and then just killing the guys and stuff. It was, obviously for me, that was very intense. And I was pretty young when I saw that. I don't necessarily remember what age, but I was very young when I did see that. And it left a huge impression on me. So, obviously that's not something I really want to do with Pippin. I want to slowly build him up, showing him the very early stuff, starting off with things like Scooby-Doo, Nightmare Before Christmas, Halloween Town, and, maybe throwing in some of like the Universal Monsters and other black and white horror movies, maybe even some colorized, horror movies, but still around the same time period as like the older Universal Monster movies and stuff like that. But then eventually, like I said, building up as he gets older to stuff like It, and and then we get older, some of the more hardcore horror movies. Maybe start throwing in like The Conjuring, start throwing in maybe some Nightmare on Elm Streets or Friday the 13th and stuff like that as they can gradually get older. So it's stuff like that. Like, obviously, once they get a more firm understanding of how the world works, about morals, and a lot of other things, this is when you can really start introducing your children to horror movies, especially the more hardcore ones. And I will admit, when Pippin starts getting older, I'm going to be incredibly excited to start showing him my favorite genre. Hi guys, thank you once again for watching this video. I had a lot of fun filming it. Zool here, he had a lot of fun filming it too. As you can tell, yeah, he's not really much of a talker, but once in a while, you can definitely hear him speak. Please take a look at our Patreon, so that way, we have a lot of really cool, fun content and stuff on there for you guys to look at. Obviously, it's obviously a means to, help support the channel, help support me, help support Zool here. As you can see, he was an amputee in the Halloween Wars. Gotta support your veterans here. Please take a look at our social media, such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I'm a little bit more active on Twitter than I used to be, so I'm posting a lot more often and whatnot on there. And then when it comes to the video, did you guys have any suggestions when it comes to raising your children on horror films? Maybe did you disagree with some of the things that I had to say? Just go ahead and put your own opinions in the comments section. Let's have a discussion, that kind of stuff. I'm very interested in what you guys have to say. And yeah, that's basically it. You guys take care. God bless. We'll see you later. Happy Halloween!